With the beautiful lines, the amazing sound, and the fact that James Bond drives one, it's impossible not to love an Aston Martin. And over the last 7 years here at VINwiki, we've heard a lot of amazing Aston Martin car stories, and today I've compiled our top 10 Aston Martin stories for you to enjoy. And I want to thank our sponsor for today's video, BetterHelp, for supporting us and supporting our viewers in whatever they need in the counseling and therapy space. BetterHelp makes counseling more accessible, easier, and more affordable than you'd ever imagine, because all you do is you log onto their website, take a quick survey about whatever you're struggling with, whatever your issues are, or whatever you're going through, and they will match you very quickly, usually within about 48 hours, with a qualified therapist who has a specialty in the area that you're trying to deal with. Whether it's relationships or work issues, depression, anxiety, whatever it is that you're trying to overcome, BetterHelp can help you. They want to make sure that you live the best version of your life, and if they don't end up matching with somebody that you kind of jive with, it's very easy to find a new one. They make the process easy. It comes to your phone or your desktop. You can do it from anywhere. I signed up for BetterHelp personally a couple of years ago, long before they were a sponsor of VINwiki, just because I was going through some things that I just wanted some help and some perspective on, and I found it immediately. They showed me kind of a different way that I could look at the problem that I was talking to them about, and it made all the difference in the world. I know the same will work for you, so check them out now at betterhelp.com/VINwiki or the link in the description below. They'll help you live a better life, and you'll get 10% off your first month. So be sure to check them out. Thank them for their support of VINwiki and get some help from BetterHelp. And now here's our top 10 VINwiki car stories about Aston Martins.
As a kid growing up, watching TV on the weekends with my dad, that would be the thing to do. The Rugby Beyond, Formula One, and if we were lucky, there might be a Bond film on TV. Ironically, because I'd had a huge crash racing in 2007, I'd broken all my ribs. I couldn't race. I was out, basically laid up. It was going to be a good month or more before I could get back in a racing car and be able to cope with all the G-forces. But within a week of being flown back from Romania, I got a phone call. I've been trying to get into movies for a while and made a few phone calls here and there, and everything kind of came back together, and I got to work on my first major feature film, which was National Treasure 2, doing some doubling for Nicolas Cage and also driving a thing called a pod car where you sit on the roof. Ended up working on this, that was my first experience working on a big movie. Biggest car chase in London's history. I think we destroyed 20 police cars and all that. Was amazing and just completely different to working on TV. Much bigger crews, huge stunt teams of 25 people, amazing sense of humour and professionalism. So it was such a good team, great fun to join. But following that, I ended up getting asked to go and work on Quantum of Solace, the Bond movie, which was Daniel Craig's second film. Something you don't say no to, but it's an incredible opportunity, an honour to be asked to go. Got out to Italy, not knowing what we would be doing. Went to another airfield, which is a dominant factor in my life, is turning up at windswept airfields. And they had a bunch of cars. We had about 12 Aston Martins and 8 Alfa Romeos. And the chase was going to be originally 3 Alfas chasing Bond in an Aston. If you watch the film, there's only 2, because a lot of the early footage we shot with 3 was cut out. Someone just said, Ben, you're Bond, in the car, get in there, go do this, go and start rehearsing. Getting to the first shooting day, wearing a pinstripe suit and the Amiga watch and all that stuff, getting into the, sort of dressed up as a character to work on that chase was just a pinch yourself moment. It was 3 months. We were filming around Lake Garda and Carrara. It's the big marble quarry there, and getting used to the Aston DBS, which is this phenomenal piece of kit, V12 engine, roughly 500 horsepower manual, which the boys had fitted with a hydraulic handbrake, so you could do some wicked stuff with that, and it's a super pliable machine. And one of the coolest days in that early on was the stunt coordinator was Gary Powell. He's done enough movies to know that one of the weakest components can be the car. So he's right, go and take it to the track and find out what breaks on it. So just drive it, drift it and slide it and just keep at it. And it turned out to be completely indestructible. You could just do anything with it, and the car wouldn't overheat. The differential wouldn't fall apart. The gearbox didn't start crunching. It was just really robust. So it was kind of Aston Martin had come of age with that model. And even though it looked very similar to the DB9, the DBS had enough subtle differences in it that made it, in my view, it felt like a completely different car. It was slightly tighter suspension, better brakes, ABS system. It was just more advanced. You could be right on the limit with it. Sharper inputs all round. Everything was just slightly better, and as a whole, it made it, very fresh car and beautiful looking thing. It was an unbelievable experience getting used to that. So I mean, effectively, what you, as a stunt driver, you fill in for the bits that require risk management that's different level to what you want the actors to be in. But Daniel was heavily involved with his parts in it and doing his driving, and got to work with him, seeing him behind the wheel for his scenes. So that was a pretty special part of it. But the mistreatment of the cars does take getting used to, because with films they say, to make an omelette you've got to crack some eggs. Still, if you're sitting in a brand new car and someone turns up with a Stanley knife to butcher the dashboard to replicate bullet hits, and they take a rock and beat it down the side of the car to mirror a scene that's just happened where it scraped a wall, it's pretty hard to watch with a $250,000 car that's being totally ruined. But it's fun at the same time, and it means you get to do stuff you'd never be able to get away with legally. So the chases were pretty amazing. I mean, speeds of up to and over 120 miles an hour through these tunnels, through and around Lake Garda. So you would be pinpoint accurate. That's where you sort of learn the level of detail of preparation and rehearsals that go into those moments to make sure that everything, the timing is very honed. Everybody knows what they're doing, what their role is, where to be and when. And it's pretty magical. And the comms side of it as well is very, very, it's almost like a military operation. All the different teams, from camera team to production and the multiple stunt teams. We had a local Italian team plus the team that was mostly from the UK but international, all working together like clockwork. It's a pretty amazing thing to be part of. The great thing with Bond is they don't do CGI. I think that was a thing they did a bit of that in the 90s, but in the modern era, it's all shot in camera. They get those cameras right in there, and they get these visceral shots because they're willing to tear it up. The scenes are real, and I think that's what audiences still flock to see. There's, sure, you're still entertaining watching movies that have got large elements of CGI. I find it a bit of a turn off in a car chase. If you suddenly get a big dollop of a fake car, you kind of, what am I watching? Is it something real or not? I think you can't fake gravity. It's very hard to replicate what it looks like when a car is hit or sliding, and also what's believable. And I like being rooted in reality. So I think a lot of audiences that you kind of project yourself into these situations, even though you'd have no chance of surviving any of these things in reality. But it's good to suspend the disbelief and enjoy it. And then for that, you need to be hooked into reality. So you worked on Skyfall in the Defender, so a little bit slower than the Aston, but still pretty awesome. So that we were in Turkey for a big chunk of that. We did a few scenes in London. Where some terrible things with a Jaguar when they were leaving London in a hurry. But that was great. I mean, I love Land Rovers, so that was pretty cool. We had the open tailgate model, and most of the time with that, I was on the roof, so driving some podcast stuff. And we had Naomi also doing the driving in a lot of those scenes. So it was really cool. But we were skidding around in it, and the Land Rover is great until you put a ton of weight on the roof, and then it kind of is thinking about tipping over. So the special effects team worked very hard with that to do what you need to do, which is lower it, extend the wheelbase out, so widen the track. And we used lower profile tyres, so it didn't want to go over so much. And it was a different experience, but still there were times where we had to drive it as it was and just consider what was going on. And up on the roof, it's a completely different experience. You do feel more detached. There's different steering systems you can use. Sometimes you can use like a remote steer, which has got a sensor that relays information and data to a control unit, so they're not physically linked, or hydraulic systems where you have that feeling, but it is more like a boat because you have whatever steering you put into it, you have to unwind it. It won't naturally return due to caster angles or anything like that. You have to unpump the pump effectively. So they're very different. So there's latency. You have to get you kind of adjust to that. And it does feel like you're sitting on top of a tractor. It's way up there. The cool thing is, though, you can see a lot more. So you've got great vision, like those cameras. If you're reversing, sometimes the cars have a little camera on the top. So that's kind of you. So if you're doing stuff like reverse J-turns through traffic, it's actually quite good because you've got better vision than everybody around. It is a very weird sensation getting used to very exaggerated forces because it's multiplied kind of 3 times. When the car leans, you feel 3 times the effect. So you need to adjust that bit in your brain that's processing that. But then you're away. It's a lot of fun. The third one I didn't do very much on was Spectre, but I did a bit of driving in the DB5 in that. and something else, and I drove another pod briefly, but I didn't do much on that film. And then I was back for the scenes in Matera with No Time to Die. I'm sure we had one more location for that. So that was, that was great to be back in. There was a crazy surface in Matera. The guy's gone out there and it was like polished stone, basically. It was potential to be the slowest car chase ever filmed because there was just no traction. So everything was kind of like dancing on ice. I'm not sure whose idea it was, but the production came up with this way of making the cars grip more by spraying Coca-Cola or some kind of soft drink onto the surface, which the tyres stuck to, which was great. The only thing was you had to keep topping it up. So as you'd be doing these runs, they kind of would wear off, and then even with it, it was gripping, but in an unconventional way. So the tyre would kind of squirm across it and slowly kind of grip into this surface, but it felt like it was going to break free, but it didn't. So it was quite unusual way to drive, but it was amazing. So super tight streets. It's a holiday destination. So if you look at Matera, there are these grotti everywhere, these sort of properties that are built in, or made of stone, built into the rock. Very tight streets. I don't know how old the places are. They're 1,000 years old. It's an ancient city, really built for tourism these days, and not for a massive crew of people to turn up with helicopters, drones, people on loudhailers yelling instructions, and a bunch of cars skidding around and blowing stuff up. But that's what happened. It was pretty awesome. So there's great scenes that were shot there. The special effects that went into designing the DB5 to produce that were off the charts, and the respect for these guys, the ability to, the car looks exactly like the original machine, but the internals completely different. I've done enough films now to see that their genius is hiding this magic underneath, so you can't see it, the audience can't tell. But it's, again, a million times better doing it for real than putting something on that's fake. The chassis is, I'm going to get this wrong, and my friends who built it are probably going to shoot me down, but effectively it's a space frame chassis. So I'm sure there's some honeycomb structure in it as well. So it's completely bespoke, but the engine's in the front as it would be in the DB5, but more power and way lighter. So the structure of it is obviously completely different to the original. I think it's carbon fiber bodywork. So again, lighter weight, but painted to a Class A grade finish. So way lighter, so the power to weight ratio is cheeky. Hydraulic handbrake, of course, because you need that. And skinny wheels, so the thing just is a drift bus, and off it goes. They're an amazing piece of kit, but beautiful. But inside, pretty rough, pretty primitive, as you would expect on a stunt car.
My boss comes across and walks me into his office and says, "Ed, don't try to sell him any more cars today." When you sell someone an exotic car, usually something they've thought about or dreamt about or shopped for a great deal of time, it's usually a great experience. But that's not always the case. And if you shop for a car remotely on the internet or by phone and you take delivery by having it shipped to you, technically you have 3 days to refuse it. But if you come to the dealership, negotiate a deal in person, pay for the car, and then drive it away, it's yours at that point. You don't get to bring it back. But as you'd imagine, selling hundreds of cars a year, sometimes people would like to. And I remember one guy in particular, because he had rented the yellow Gallardo that I had for supercar rentals. And he had driven it around for the weekend and loved it, and showed me at the time the Lotus Esprit that was in his garage that he never drove and meticulously detailed. And as he came into the dealership a few years later, he said that he had sold the Lotus, but he wanted another sports car. And so we started looking around, and he really had his eye on an Aston Martin Vanquish, but he wanted a stick. And at the time, probably 2012, they were starting to become more and more rare. But we had one that was gorgeous, had every carbon option and all the updates for 2012 and on. We reached something that was agreeable, but the whole deal took a long time. And in fact, we didn't really finish up everything and have him signed and financed and all the paperwork done until after we would have normally closed at about 6 o'clock. And at that point, it had kind of gotten dark. And so he drove off to head home and was actually really kind of nervous about it because he never wanted the car to have any imperfections. And you'd imagine driving at 40, 50 miles to his house, it was going to have the chance of something like that happening. But we said, you know what, just keep some distance, drive slow, you'll be fine. And we're closed the next day on Sunday, but the first thing on Monday, that Vanquish comes rolling right back in. He had kind of wrapped it with like a temporary style clear bra to protect it as he would drive it back. And as he got out of the car, he had a big piece of paper On it was a handwritten list of every single imperfection in this brand new car that he had just bought. And he was furious about it. And as I went through kind of the things that he was upset about, they were all really the product of it being a hand-built Aston Martin. Because while Astons are unbelievably high quality cars with quality materials that are built by people who are meticulous, they're hand-built. So it's not a stamped out Japanese or American car that comes off an assembly line every 17 seconds. And obviously his first request was, just give me my money back, take the car back, and we'll think about something on another day. And we were not going to do that. We weren't going to give him his money back and unwind a deal and not have the profit that we had in it. So over the course of the day, he's just distraught, going back and forth. I ended up taking him to lunch, just kind of trying to talk him off the ledge and love the car that he loved 48 hours prior to that. And it really just was not working. So as we got back, I said, you know what, look, maybe the one that you bought is a little bit below average. I'm not sure that's the case, but let's look at some other cars and just see if maybe you want to trade into something else. I mean, certainly there's been some depreciation because we'll have to title the car. We've punched the warranty and everything else has started on it. But let's see what we could do to maybe move you into another one. And we had a very similarly spec'd black on black Vantage S. And so we ended up taking that out of a test drive just to let him see, would you prefer the paddle shift? And he did kind of like that and thought, well, maybe this car that was developed a little bit later somehow is in higher quality or better condition. And there was no good way to expect that, but we let him look around. We kind of said, look, just make sure that you're comfortable with it. But again, the whole negotiation and trying to figure out the trade value of a 2-day-old car on another new car that we certainly did want to sell took a good while. And so that went into the night again after we would normally have closed, but he agreed to buy it. He paid for the difference, and then we just kind of did a collateral swap on his loan, I think, and he drives off into the night. But as you'd expect, the next morning he comes back and he spent all night with his bright lights in his garage finding every single imperfection in the car. Every panel gap that's slightly different side to side, or trim piece that's a little bit misaligned, or little speck in the paint, whatever he finds, he's just livid again. And so, as you'd expect, I move him to another car. Let's look around this one, see if it's any better. Maybe it'll live up to your expectation. We'll do what we did yesterday and let you write us a little bit of a check and have a different one. And as we were walking around the showroom looking at other cars, trying to find out the most perfect one of the bunch, my boss comes across and walks me into his office and says, Ed, don't try to sell him any more cars today. Whatever ends up happening, which will not involve us giving his money back and unwinding these two deals, let's make it only involve these two cars rather than another one. And at some point, you just kind of have to, look, go drive your car, enjoy it. When you bring it back and trade it back to us on whatever you decide you want next, we're still going to give you all the money anyone will, because it's going to be above our standards. We want to be respectful of your own, but at the end of the day, it's a hand-built exotic car that's built in very low quantities. And we ended up finding out that about a week later, he traded it in on a gray Maserati. Brand new from a dealer down the street, and all the power to him. I cannot imagine that any Maserati was going to be a better quality car, other than by random happenstance, than this Vantage was. But I know that they ended up running that Vantage through the auction, and I would imagine the reason he did that is they were the only people who had enough spread on their new car to allow him enough to make him reasonably content with the deal he got on the trade value. But perhaps the most interesting story I have about immediate buyer's regret was also a different gray Maserati. But there was a guy who had been coming around for the last few months kind of looking for his next sports car. And he mentioned that he had had a Maserati Grand Sport, an 05 or 06 Cambia Corsa car, and he loved it, which was kind of a unique sentiment for a Grand Sport or any Maserati of that vintage. But we ended up getting in on consignment a 2005 Maserati Spider Cambia Corsa paddle shift car, and it was pretty nice. I mean, it's one of those things you get kind of nervous about selling because there was a pretty good chance something bad was going to happen not long after he buys it, because it's a pretty good chance something's going to happen every day you go out and drive a Maserati. I think he was probably early 50s Italian guy, lived in Atlanta for a long time, and was really excited. It did fit what he was looking for. So didn't take long. He agreed to everything. We got it all set up, signed the paperwork, and I pulled the car around after we had it kind of cleaned up and ready to go. We walked through all the things and kind of just left him there to leave in the car. So I went back inside and was doing something at my desk, and I see him kind of pull around to a different part of the parking lot and park in front of a different door and walk inside, and he wanted to ask something about his temp tag or something else. And the slant in our parking lot was not very steep, but it was slight, and certainly if you put a car in neutral and didn't engage the parking brake, which is precisely what he had done, it might roll backwards. And it rolled backwards about 20 feet into a parked Jaguar that we had on the front line in inventory ready to sell. So he comes in just freaking out after he's gone out and observed the damage and seen that there's some scratches and, a little bit of a dent on each of the cars. And it wasn't going to be that major, but obviously the idea of having to repaint part of your new to you Italian sports car is not something that makes you wildly pleased. So he's like, I don't know, I shouldn't leave it in today. I can't do this. And you need to take it back. It's your car that y'all let get damaged. And we're like, no, I mean, you parked it in a way that allowed it to damage the car. We're not that upset. We'd like you not to be upset. And as we went back and forth, we kind of like, look, we don't want to sour the relationship over this. Let's just say we'll fix ours, you fix yours. It's going to be a few $100 to repaint each bumper. Nobody's going to worry about it. We'll move on down the road. And he reluctantly, after a few hours of groveling and whining, he did leave. And again, we were closed the next day on Sunday. But first thing Monday morning, a woman walks in. Elderly woman, pretty Italian looking. Tons of makeup, just a painted on face, and huge rhinestone glasses, dressed far beyond how someone normally would to come to a car dealership on a Monday morning. And she comes in and she asks if she could speak to the general manager. And it was one of those days that I was very pleased to not be the general manager. There were lots of days like that. And so I directed her to his office, and she walked right in, set herself down. And this woman was the mother of the person who had just bought the Maserati. And she had come in, I guess, to rescue her son, probably after he had whined and groveled to her about the regret he had for having become so emotional and bought this Italian sports car over the weekend. And she felt like we should just unwind everything, give his money back, and not blame him for the mistakes of his, I guess, youth in his 50s or whatever. My boss was having none of it and continued to kind of indulge her in her need to express whatever sentiment she had about our business practices of, selling cars to people who test drove them and wanted to buy them. But she did not prevail. So after probably an hour or so, she left a little bit perturbed. And throughout the afternoon, she would call back several times, trying to find someone who could make a decision and also give her a different answer to her question. And we all towed the company line that when you buy it, it's yours. If you do buy your next exotic car, do think about it, test drive it, and think about what it's going to be like when you wake up with it in the morning. Because most of the time you love it, but sometimes you don't. But either way, it's still yours.
Ralph gave his Vanquish, his personal Vanquish, to my father. One of the more interesting cars I've had, and certainly a car that I've had for a long time, is my 2003 Aston Martin Vanquish. Growing up as a child of the 80s, it was always, were you Team Testarossa or Team Countach? And I was always Team Countach. The Aston Martin Vanquish is a very interesting car. So the story of this car is my father worked for Ralph Lauren as the president and chief operating officer for 15 years, from 2000 to 2015. And my dad was a big Bond fan. And so around 2005, Ralph gave his Vanquish, his personal Vanquish, to my father as a gift. I don't remember what the exact milestone was. It wasn't like his birthday or anything, but he gave my dad the car. And it's an '03 Vanquish. It has, it's dark titanium, the James Bond color, the standard, dark gray. But it's unique because it has a purple label interior. Not purple, the color. Ralph Lauren purple label, leather and suede. They sent the swatches to Aston Martin, and they do the interior with that. Aston Martin, if you're Ralph Lauren, they'll do that for you. They also have his name is stamped in the door sill, which is very cool. Hand built in England for Ralph Lauren. My dad is not that into cars, and he's very tall. He's like 6'5", and he worked so much that he would only really drive to the golf course on weekends, but his golf bag wouldn't even fit in a Vanquish. And so I was living locally at the time. I was running I had graduated from college. I was running the detailing shop with Larry around that time. And while he didn't give me the car, I basically became its custodian. I drove it once a week or so. I didn't, I was in my 20s. I didn't have to ask permission. I drove it. And to go back to my privilege and my growing up and being more honest about myself, I used to pretend it was a little more mine than it is. You know what I mean? It was his, and I drove it a lot and I cared for it, but I wanted to seem more self-made than I was. And I would tell not entire truths about that car. This is the truth about the car. My dad loved it, but he never really showed all that much interest in driving it, you know, besides having it in the garage and taking it out once a month or whatever. In about 2013, when the car had, I don't know, 8,000 miles on it. It did not have a lot of miles on it. We got it with like 3,500, and it did not get driven all that much. But Pops and I decided that we would send the car back to England to have Newport Pagnell, the Aston Martin Works factory, convert it to a stick, which is very expensive. And the entire time they're doing it, Aston Martin treats you like they're doing some huge favor for you, and you should somehow thank them, and not that you've paid them this astronomical amount of money to fix their horrible gearbox. But I will say that the car is fabulous. I mean, and while I was there, we had them wire open the exhaust baffles, so it was on loud mode all the time, which is a beautiful tone. I mean, you know, beautiful sounding car. And it's a stick. And it's, other than having 3 pedals in a pedal box sized for 2 pedals, aside from that, honestly, you wouldn't know it didn't come like that from the factory. I mean, they did a really beautiful job. They made the interior look right. The shifter doesn't look out of place. You know, everything works. And it's a beautiful car that I really, really love to drive. The only downside is I have to take my shoes off to drive it because the pedal box is so small. And that is annoying. But, you know, the powertrain is great. There's some part spin stuff. But especially when you compare it to the brand new Astons, my God, is it pretty and elegant and subtle and timeless. And I think as far as a long-term hold, in the long term, pretty and sounding good is what it takes. The car could be a total hunk of shit. They could have blinkers out of a Volvo and headlights from a whatever else. But if it's pretty and it sounds good, it's a good long play. And so I will never sell this car. My dad will, technically he still owns it, but he does. It's mine. He'll never sell it. I'll never sell it. And, you know, I feel like Pebble Beach 2040, you know, that car will over time become incredibly appreciated, and not necessarily in a money way, in a cultural way, because of how beautiful it is and because of what it did for Aston Martin at that time, and because you can still use it. It's a great car to use. There's nothing about that car that would prevent me from getting in it and driving it across the country right now. It's fine. So the Aston Martin is really cool. It doesn't get driven that much, but it is very cool.
And I got tons of comments. What about all the Bond cars? And I go, well, yeah. So I own the most famous Aston Martin on the internet, is essentially what it boils down to. And the way I came about it was formerly owned by Doug DeMuro. It was then acquired by Tavarish, 2 very well-known YouTubers, and then it was acquired by me. Actually, there is a little bit of an interesting backstory to this. When I used to go to the New York Auto Show, because I'm based in New Jersey, I would always go and take pictures with my crummy little flip phone. Like, yeah, awesome, let's take a picture of this Aston Martin on this 1 megapixel, like Game Boy looking thing. So apparently a Facebook memory popped up, I think a couple of months ago after I bought the Aston, and it was a DB9 from probably like 2008. It says, I will own you one day. And I was like, oh, well, I own an Aston Martin now, so that's kind of interesting. I'd always known about the Aston through Doug, of course, Doug DeMuro, one of the biggest car YouTubers out there. He bought it for his Doug car, and he famously took it across the entire country, but probably even more famously had the bumper-to-bumper limited mileage warranty. And of course, everyone that knows Doug and knows cars on YouTube would follow that whole thing. How he drove it through the snow, how he drove it to, Wyoming, and has a picture next to a bison, probably one of the only pictures next to a bison of an Aston Martin ever created. So that was kind of neat. But I'd always followed that car, and I always liked Aston Martin for its aesthetic appeal. It always had really cool engine notes, and it was always on my radar as a car company to purchase from, but never at the top. Like even now, my attainable dream car is a Jaguar F-Type R, because it sounds ridiculous. I've driven almost the entire range, all the way from the base up to the SVR. The car is really, really cool. It just doesn't have a manual in the V8, which is a bummer, but the V6 with the manual sounds glorious. The V8 has with all those pops and crackles. So that's my attainable dream car. But Aston had kind of always been on the radar. He sells it to Freddie. Freddie and I know each other through other things we've done together, and we did the press car together back with the FRS, so that's how we met. And you know, we always kept in touch, and I followed the Aston on his channel too. He put an X-pipe exhaust in it. Basically sounds like a NASCAR at open throttle now. And you know, it was sort of this thing where, you know, it was always just in the background. It was never, oh, you know, oh, I gotta have that car. I want that car. So Freddie Tavares, as you guys probably all know him on YouTube, bought the Lamborghini twin turbo Spider. And that has basically skyrocketed his channel. And when he got it, he reached out to me and said, hey, you know, I don't really need the room. I have enough room for these cars, but do you want to buy the Aston? I know you had liked it, and I know you followed it through the whole story with Doug, and we watched it on my channel too. But you know, I'd like it to go to a good home. You know, since this was my attainable dream car, the Freddie talking, and I said, yeah, definitely yes, I want the Aston. So of course I had to check with my wife first and make sure that it was an okay purchase. But basically I took it, and I'm trying to bring it back to its former glory, because Doug or Freddie didn't mishandle the car in any way. Doug had the warranty. He had a ton of work done to it under warranty, got a lot of the mechanicals in order. Freddie took care of it, you know, very, very well. It was garage kept it out of the rain, didn't, you know, do a ton of crazy modifications to it, but I kind of wanted to bring it back to its former glory. Because, you know, it's an older car. It's 2007. The wheels have big chunks taken out of them, and you know, it was a used car, like but it was used in the way it should have been. You know, a lot of these exotic cars, you see your garage queens, and people don't drive them. I like cars that are driven, you know, and that's kind of one of the reasons why it really piqued my interest when Freddie wanted to sell it to me, because I know it had been used. I know it had been loved by two really good enthusiasts, and people that had watched the series really loved the car too. So it has 68,000 miles on it now, and it's not the most high mileage Aston Martin in the country or the world. I routinely see Aston Martin's V8 Vantages specifically on Car Gurus and Auto Trader and all these other sites and whatever that have near 100,000 or over 100,000 miles on it. And it's strangely a dead reliable car from a mechanical standpoint, because the engine, it's an AJ block that Aston basically stroked to 4.3 themselves. But the AJ block is, you know, same thing that Jaguar uses, the same thing that Ford uses since what seems like the beginning of time. I think AJ engines date back 40, 50 years now. So, you know, they started with a great platform, and they just kind of made it their own. But it's quite reliable from an engine standpoint, at least. When we bought it, you know, people were like, yeah, you bought the Doug car, that's really cool. But people were also like, wow, this is a third generation YouTube car. You probably should have bought something else. What a terrible decision you've made. So I'm sitting there going, wow, that's not really the reaction I wanted, but okay, cool. Let's see where this goes. So there's a couple of things I still want to do to the car. The dashboard has a bit of leather that's totally pulled up. There's a few things I've done to it aesthetically. The wheels were just totally knackered, and I replaced those with some BC Racing wheels that, you know, a little bit of snowflake to them. They're nice wheels. They're almost like HRE light. HREs, you know, I looked into the wheels for that car, and they were like 12, 13 grand. I'm like, I'm not spending a third of the price of this car on wheels. Not a thing that's happening. So they were the right price, so I put them on. And they were insanely light, very, very cool wheels. Put some sticky Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tires on it, and it just transformed the car into this really angry beast of a car that could handle way better than it could with these bald Pirelli tires that were on it before. So we've done that to the car. I've wrapped it from its silver. Now it's this dark blue that is stunningly gorgeous. I mean, repainting this car would have been $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 at a minimum. With Aston Martin paint, God, probably $20,000, $30,000. But the wrap, you know, turned out to be very, very cheap, and I think it was only $4,000, but it looks like factory fresh paint, so that was really kind of nice. And it just looks like a totally different car, which is really cool. And I bring it to events by me. There's a great group by me called Cars and Chai, because they can't do cars and coffee. But they're a bunch of supercar owners. They have McLarens and F40s and even really, really neat old British cars like Triumphs. And every time I pull up to an event with it, everyone looks at it and says, "Oh my God, that car is gorgeous." So, and not even because it's like the Doug car or the Freddie car, but they love it because it's an interesting looking Aston Martin, and that's part of the reason why I bought it. I wanted to transform it into a car that a lot of people could enjoy, not just myself, bring it to events. People look at it and love it, and on the highway, people rolling down their windows, "What even is that?" Like, a lot of people don't even know what it is, and you explain it to them and like, "Wow, that's really cool. I have to look up more about Aston Martin. I didn't even know that car existed." And I'm like, "Cool, you may have made a whole new car enthusiast out of, just a random meeting at a stoplight." So I think that's kind of neat. But that's how I kind of came to own the most famous internet Aston Martin in the world. It's probably been seen, oh God, with Doug's videos and Freddie's videos, probably over 20 or 30 million times at a minimum. So, I mean, every video Doug made with it had, 500,000 to 1 million views on it. So to say that it's the most famous Aston Martin on the internet, I don't think is a stretch, because I don't know there's another Aston that has that kind of viewership to it.
I threw a bunch of donuts in your car. He's like, "Perfect. That's what we need to know. Let's go do that again right now." So anytime you get a new brand or a new car to sell as a dealership, you learn pretty quick what errors and what issues mechanically they're prone to having. And when we got the Aston Martin franchise, we learned before too long that most of our problems with them were going to revolve around transmissions. And we learned particularly that some of the older cars were exceptionally prone to gearbox failure, and any kind of car that has a sequential manual gearbox is somewhat prone to actuator failure and pump failure and everything else. But Astons, particularly Vanquishes, were particularly prone to this type of failure. That's why you'll see guys like Matera converting theirs to sticks, because by the time you replace the actuator and the F1 pump and a clutch and a throwout bearing, you end up being in the 25 to 35 grand zone, and for about 40 grand you can convert it to a stick. And what happens is, as these kind of time bomb issues start to plague cars like that, I call it the Maserati problem. They start to cause depreciation for the cars because people just aren't really willing to stomach the notion that at any moment this car might cost them 20 or 30% or more of its value for a non-freak accident sort of thing. Certainly things happen, motors blow and things like that, but if you don't really think it's going to happen to you, you don't worry about it. If you buy a Vanquish from anyone who's telling you something that's honest by any stretch of the imagination, they're going to let you know that the monster in the closet, the boogeyman of the car, is the shift actuator failure. And so this guy had just had this happen. A customer, he brought in this car, and it was beautiful. It was sort of an iridescent purplish tone, and the Aston paints are gorgeous, and the customer satisfaction from Aston Martin is always exceptionally high. We had more repeat buyers of Aston Martin cars than any other brands we sold, because they had this idea, they got wrapped up in the mystique of the brand, and they felt like James Bond when they drove them. I mean, it was just the perfect product placement and just the greatest brand image you could ever imagine for a sports car manufacturer. But this guy had just spent 30-something thousand bucks getting his car back to running, and he was over it, and he was ready for something new. So we got him a deal on a brand new DBS that we had some rebates on, and Aston margins tended to be pretty wide, so you could really discount them quite a bit and potentially still even make a bit of money. But we ended up giving him, I think, 45 grand as a trade value for an early Vanquish that had just had this shift actuator repair done. And he was just happy to get out of it and get into something new that was at least a little bit more trustworthy, because the newer DB9s and the DBS used a true ZF 6-speed automatic gearbox, and it was supposedly pretty bulletproof, but we learned before too long that it was not immune to such types of failures. Fortunately for us, most of the cars we were selling at the time in that vintage were all still under warranty. And so not long after he took his brand new DBS home and he's loving the car, it gives him a strange transmission malfunction where he's just driving it and all these lights come on and it shuts down and it refuses to start for a moment, and then eventually it fires back up and he can drive it. And so he has it flatbedded to us in the roadside assistance policy, and it's coming down from his house in Tennessee because our geographic area was rather large from here in Atlanta. So the car shows up and we can't make it do it again. We can't replicate the issue. It's not storing a code or anything we can reference back, and it wasn't really a common enough issue that we could say, oh, it's doing that thing the way we had with a Vinstore gearbox failures not long after that. But we just eventually have to tell him, look, we've driven your car around, we've tested everything, we've used all the diagnostics we're capable of, and we can't make it break in the way you're describing, so we've got to send it back to you. Not long after that, it happens to him again and he sends it back, and we go through the same thing. We can't make it fail the way he says it fails again, so we send it back to him. Of course, a few weeks later, same thing happens, and he gets it shipped down. And at this point, he's starting to get upset. He's talking about lemon law and other things, and the manufacturer's starting to step in and say, look, we're not going to send you the car back until we can replicate this issue. Because it wasn't like the guy's lying. I mean, he's going through a massive inconvenience to be without his car for a considerable amount of time. So we promised him we're going to get the car to do this. So we start driving it, road testing it, all the different techs, all the different circumstances we could find, trying to replicate the nature of the failure, and it won't do it. So eventually we get to the point where we've put probably hundreds of miles on his car at this point, and we're just passing the car around at night for somebody to drive home and just say, look, drive it in whatever circumstance you can think of, and let's see what we can make it do. But no one could make it fail. So then, the rotation came around and it was my turn to drive the car home. So I get the keys and I take it home, and I had to go and meet somebody on my way home, like at a shopping mall or something like that. And when I got there, I was just sort of thinking like, all right, we've got a gearbox error, but it could be something tangential to the gearbox, a drive shaft differential, an axle issue, something like that. And so maybe we need to put a little bit more stress on that. So I've got this big wide open mall parking lot, and I'm like, what do? I start slinging donuts and sliding the car around and making sure that all the traction control systems are off, all the sport systems are, as aggressive as they could possibly be, and just to see what the car can do. And I'm having a blast, sliding it all over the place. I think it had rained a little bit that day, so it was nice and slippery, but the car doesn't freak out. But the minute I pulled back out onto the main street, it does it. Every light comes on, transmission malfunction, the car shuts off and won't restart for a moment. I turn the flashers on because I'm in the middle of a relatively busy road, and just wait a few minutes, and then finally I get the car to restart. So I text our service manager, I say, hey, I got it to work, I'll tell you everything in the morning. So I go home that night, and the next morning I go into the dealership and I explain, look, yeah, I was sliding it around, but that seemed to be what it takes. Perhaps that's what the customer was failing to mention to us that he'd been doing in the car. So our service manager called the national Aston Martin service rep, and he flew in to talk to us. And the next day he comes in, and we knew this guy, he'd come in fairly often for other problematic Astons. He walked into the service manager's office, and they get talking, and they're like, all right, well, I need to talk to the guy who made this happen. And so he says, go see Ed. So a few minutes later, he walks up to my desk and says, I need to know exactly what you did to cause this failure. And I'm a little bit like, I just kind of cornered with it hard and took some turns pretty fast. He's like, no. I need to know exactly what you did. I said, well, I threw a bunch of donuts in your car. He's like, perfect. That's what we need to know. Let's go do that again right now. And so I kind of look at my boss and I'm like, are you sure you want me to do this? He said, absolutely, go do it. Let's make it happen. So we went out and we found a big parking lot, and we just start hooning around in this DBS and sliding all over the place and being, proper James Bond villain chasers, and had a blast, and he was loving it, but obviously it didn't do it until we stopped doing that and went back out onto a road where, of course, immediately it throws all the lights. So he was like, perfect, thank you so much. You've made it happen, that's what we needed. So we eventually get it restarted and get it back to the dealership, and the next day, they shipped in every possible part to replace pretty much anything they could think of, because they obviously didn't want to have to buy this car back, and they wanted to get it back to the owner. And by the time we did, I bet we'd put 700 or 800 miles on the car, but he was just thrilled to have his car back, and owned it for a good long while. I think eventually he traded it on the new Vanquish, but I'm sure he loved every functional mile the car had.
I'll admit, I was Spinderella. I was spinning a lot. So one of the companies I work a lot for is Aston Martin, technically Aston Martin the Americas, the North American arm. And I do several things for them. So I'm a driving instructor, which means I demonstrate cars and teach folks how to drive them at speed. Product specialist, so I can present the cars and talk in depth about the cars. And I'm even a translator for them. So when they've got training at their headquarters in Irvine and they bring up folks from Central and South America that don't speak English, techs that they're teaching new stuff, I come in to translate essentially. And it's weird because growing up as a Spanish speaker is my first language. Obviously I speak Spanish, but when you start talking about cam position sensors and electrical systems in cars, I didn't grow up saying those terms. So a lot of these things I've had to look up to, how do I say that in Spanish? So it's an interesting thing doing the translation, but that's one of the things I do for them. And then the other thing I do for them, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about, is level 2 training. So at Aston Martin, there are 5 levels of training. Level 1 is you can start and operate a car within a parking lot. Level 2 is you can drive the car on the streets, a car owned by Aston Martin. Level 3 is demonstrating the car on a racetrack. Level 4 is on the Mira proving grounds in the UK. And level 5 is Nürburgring development testing. And so I train anybody in North America that works for the company on level 2 training. It used to be that a gentleman named Alan White would fly in from the UK and train the people, but as they hire more people and the company was growing, that became, not very cost effective. And so they decided to train me. So Alan White came out and trained me on training other people. So part of the class that I teach that Alan White came out and taught me, that I teach for the level 2 certification, is about basic roadcraft. How do you position the car on the road? How do you pay attention to signs, that kind of thing. And the last slide that I sort of created and turned into my part of my presentation is what I'm going to tell you about now. And it's about trusting your instincts. We work a program in Crested Butte, Colorado, or used to work a program in Crested Butte, Colorado. Used to be being probably pretty key to the story for 3 years, 2014, 15, and 16, called Aston Martins on Ice. And as the name implies, it's winter driving. So teaching folks how to drive these Aston Martins on snow and ice. And the program starts in the spring because we go out and lay out the track from this gentleman who rents us the property and put up stakes so that when it snows, we start prepping the track. And there's a big process to getting the track ready to be driven on. But we get out there and these folks pay a lot of money. I think it's like $10,000 a day to come out and spend some time with us. And it's an amazing program because you're driving these cars on snow and ice. But my point in including this last slide where it's trusting your instincts is what this story is about. To tell the full story, I'm going to go to the final year of the program, 2016. That particular year, the agency that puts on this program for Aston rented the track out 2 weeks prior to Mazda. And Mazda had just launched the MX-5 Miata, or it had recently been launched. And they also rented, along with the track, us instructors. So we're out there doing a program for a week for Mazda, and we're part of the program, as pretty much any program that I work for car manufacturers, at the very end, we do what we call hot laps. And that's when we put the participants in the passenger seat, we turn off all the stability and traction control systems in the cars, and we show them what the car can do. And being in Miatas and having worked the program 2 years prior in Astons, it's funny how there's this mental switch that happens because as a driver, you're like, well, if I wad up this Miata, I can probably afford the 30 grand, the 25 grand, or it got cost, to buy it. And so you're less concerned, kinda. You still don't want to crash because it's bad for your reputation and all that stuff. But you know that if you crash, it's not the end of the world. If you crash an Aston, a $300 and some $1,000 Aston, that's going to be a little bit more difficult to deal with. And so we do this program for Mazda. At the end of the week, we've been given hot laps for a week, and the hot laps have gotten more and more brave, I'll say. We start, instead of running separately, we're now running together. We're doing tandem drift, and then you have, in some cases, all 6 of us instructors, nose to tail, sliding these cars around. And it was amazing. It was amazing from our perspective. The participants loved it as well. Then some of the guys started getting even more brave and doing like 360s down the straight, recovering, or doing a 360 right into a drift into the first turn, which was a big sweeping turn. It was amazing, and it was a lot of fun. And the MX-5 Miata is an awesome car to drive. Anybody that thinks, chick car, whatever, amazing car. Yes, it's slow, but it's fun to drive. So fast forward, we then had a week off, everybody returned home, and then we came back to the track, and now we're doing the Aston program for the final year in 2016. It's funny how we all start sort of semi-conservative on the hot laps the first day of the program, but by day 3, our memories of what we were just doing a couple weeks prior in the Miatas start coming back to, and a couple guys start taking more liberties, and before you know it, we're all doing 360s down the back straight in $300,000 Astons, right? And you could see that the Aston executives were getting more and more nervous when we would go out to give hot laps. And they're seeing some of us run closer together and taking more chances. And so the program ends and we survive. Nothing happens. We did our hot laps. The participants left super happy. And the cool thing about the hot lap at the end is that the participants have done all their driving, but you leave them on this high because we put them in the car with us and slide the car around, and they just leave like super pumped up. Most of the executives have now left and gone back to the hotel. Some of them are receiving the cars at the hotel. So our job now is to drive the 20-some cars that we had there back to the hotel, which is about 15 minutes away. There are transporters waiting. We help them load them on. We go get shuttled back to the track and bring the cars back. And so we're wrapping up, and the film crew comes over, and there was 3 of us that happened to be on site at that point. The other 3 instructors were shuttling cars. And the film crew comes over and says, hey, Emile, we want to do a couple more shots. Do you guys mind driving? And this is the part that I tell in my story when I'm presenting the class, and it's about trusting your instincts. My instincts at that time were absolutely not, we don't need to do it. The film crew had been there the entire week, had gotten amazing footage. I'd seen some of the selects. It was awesome. Aston people were happy. Like I said, they'd left. But you don't want to say no. And also you kind of don't want to look like that guy. You don't want to be the chicken, right? Kind of. And so you're like, it was more like I just didn't want to say no to them. I'm like, all right, what do you guys need? And the film crew said, we want 3 cars out there, and they just happened to be the 3 that were left. V12 Vantage, V8 Vantage Roadster, the GT, and the Vanquish that was there. And so as we're figuring out, the 2 other instructors, 2 great friends of mine, some of my best friends, make a beeline to the cars. And as I turn around and I walk out, what am I left with? I'm left with the V12 Vantage, arguably the trickiest one. V12, shortest wheelbase, not quite as much steering lock, but I had been in that car all week. I'd been given hot laps in that car all week. I love that car. So at first I was like, of course they leave me with this. First guy there, I'm sure, jumped in the Vanquish, longest wheelbase, torquey, smooth V12, and mine was a manual. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. We get out there, and the camera crew was in, I forget what kind of SUV, but they're in an SUV, 4-wheel drive, studded tires, and they're filming out of the back of this thing. So already you're like, you've gotten all the footage. This can't be that amazing, the footage that you're gonna get now, but whatever. We don't wanna say no, so we're out there doing it. And so what happens, we go out and do the first lap, and the guy that's directing the thing gets on the radio, and my buddy Steph, one of the other drivers, is driving the camera car, so I forgot there was 4 of us there. Guy gets on the radio and goes, guys, we're gonna pick up the pace a little bit. And keep in mind, now this is the end of the program, so we've been out there for about a week. And the track, the grip in snow and ice, those of you watching that haven't driven in snow and ice, you look for snow when you're in those conditions, because snow is grip. Snow has a ton of grip and ice does not. It sounds pretty obvious. And so throughout the week as we're giving hot laps, we're looking for the edges of the track where there's still some snow, because that's where the grip is, and the ice is no grip on the ice. So now we've worn through the snow, and if it snowed the night before, then we have fresh powder at the beginning of the day, but we wear through that as well. It's the end of the last day. The track is basically an ice track. It's no longer a snow and ice track, it's an ice track. And so we're putting, sliding the cars, nose to tail, 3 of us, completely sideways, but 12 miles an hour, maybe 20 miles an hour, 0 traction. So the guy asked us to speed up a little bit, and I'm like, we kind of can't, but okay, so the car starts pulling away, we're trying to go a little more quickly. And I'll admit, I was the guy. So we come around and I spin, run out of talent, run out of steering lock, bad combination, I spin around. And now my big concern is Matthew, one of my friends right behind me, can he get around me? And he was in the Vanquish. And as soon as I see that he avoids me, the next car has even more time. So no worries, another friend of mine. And he avoids me, so I'd spin. So we get back together, we start running again, and then Matthew would spin, or Ram, one of us would spin. And I'll admit, I was Spinderella. I was spinning a lot. My instincts were telling me like, stop, what are you doing? Just put an end to this. At any point, any one of the 3 of us could have picked up the radio and said, hey guys, the conditions are treacherous, we're done. And we didn't. So you know where this is going. I would spin, the guys would avoid me. Matthew would spin, they would avoid me. We kept switching the order. So here comes the incident. I'm the first car. My friend Matthew's behind me. My friend Ram's behind him. We're coming around, final sweeping turn. So it's like a faster big sweeper right behind the camera car. And I start to run out of steering lock, and I've got a lot of angle, and I'm coming out of it. I'm trying to hold it there, but I can come at the lock stops. This is it. And here comes the car, and it starts to rotate. I had enough time to pick up the radio and say, spin, spin, spin. That's how slowly all of this is happening, right? As I'm coming around, I look, and my main concern is the first car behind me, the Vanquish. And I look, Matthew aborts his slide, avoids me, no problem. And here comes my buddy Ram, and I see him coming, and he's not aborting his slide. And I'm like, whew, okay, the first car missed me, but he's still sliding, and we kind of locked eyes. And I just remember watching it in slow motion. In hindsight, I probably didn't have time. It probably happened faster than I think. But in hindsight, I probably had enough time to hit the reverse button and try to get some traction and back out of the way. But I was just incredulous to what I was seeing happening in front of me. And sure enough, I watched him in slow motion slide. So I had spun and was facing them, slide right into my car. 2 Astons coming together, never a good thing. Boom, big impact, no airbags, because again, the speeds were relatively low, but you still touched 2 Astons. And I just remember thinking, what the, like, how did that happen? Later on, talking to Steph, my other buddy who was driving the camera car, Steph, Matthew, myself, all do a lot of camera, car-to-car work for TV commercials and that kind of thing. We have a lot of experience following folks. Ram less so, but having said that, out of all of us there, the 6 of us, the guy with the best car control was him. He is a super talented driver. Former WRC driver, the only American signed by ProDrive. He's the man. And I remember talking to him just like being like, I couldn't believe that he'd crashed into me. Again, I'm the one that spun, but still. And he's like, I thought I had it. And I'm like, that's not good enough. What do you mean you thought you had it? And I love the guy to death. He's one of my favorite human beings on the planet. So it's not like I could get mad at him. And again, I'm the one that spun, but it doesn't change the fact that we've crashed 2 Astons. Now we have to make the call. Oh, by the way, we crashed 2 cars. The head of training for Aston had become a good friend of mine. We're neighbors, we barbecue together, that kind of thing. And he's the one I have to make the call to. So I make the call. And I remember him saying, obviously he's busy tying up, whatever, getting the cars on the transporter and tying up the program. And he's like, yeah, that's not funny, Emile. And I'm like, no, Scott, we crashed 2 cars. And I hear the pause, the long pause on the phone. And he goes, tell me you're joking, because it's not a funny joke. And I said, I wish I was joking. We crashed 2 cars. And again, a long silence on the phone, followed by things you never want to hear, right? You dumb, all deserved. And you got to take it. So I'm on the phone listening to this. And then he passes the phone to the marketing director, who's really, it's his program, right? And this guy, he starts in, and again, we crashed 2 cars. We got to take it. So we're listening to it. And you're still like, you're sick to your stomach. And you look at the cars and they're not bad, but again, they're Astons. So it's going to be expensive, and it was very expensive. And so we had to get back to the hotel with the cars, and those cars had to get loaded, and we had a meeting, and we again had to be beaten down, and we took it because we deserved it. It was a horrible ending to a couple of really great work weeks. The one with Mazda, we had a week off between, and then the week with Aston. But the bottom line, the reason I decided to tell the story to the folks that I teach in this L2, level 2 driving permit class is to trust your instincts, right? As humans, I think that we've forgotten to really trust our gut. But in this case, it was so obvious to me, and I just didn't listen. And had I listened, it would have been the end of a couple of great weeks, and the program might have continued. So later on, a couple of years later, maybe about a year ago, I remember sitting with my buddy Scott, we're drinking a couple of beers, and I said to him, the head of training for Aston Martin, and I said to him, hey, by the way, that crash in Crested Butte, is that the reason the program got canceled? And I'll never forget her response. He just looks at me and goes, well, it certainly didn't help.
Wow, it looks like it was owned by a drug lord. Earlier this year, in March of 2020, right before the pandemic that shut the world down, I got together with Tavarish and Hoovy, and we shot a series called Car Trek. It was very much us trying to play Top Gear. We wanted to see if we could pull something like that off. We worked with a sponsor, Auto Tempest, for the production budget, and it was obviously buying a lot of cars that we normally would have bought anyway, because the premise that we came up with was, what is the coolest car you could buy for about the same price as a C8 Corvette? Obviously at the time, and even since then, the new mid-engine C8 Corvette with a $59,000 base MSRP was all the news, all the rage. Everybody was really excited about it. We all thought you could buy something cooler. So you saw me buy a flood-titled Lamborghini Gallardo Spider with a gated manual transmission. Hoovy bought a 360 Spider, and Freddie bought a V12 Vantage S. And they were all awesome cars in their own right. Mine was clearly the best. I still own it because of the miserable ad that I deliberately wrote to kind of sabotage its sale and losing the contest, but having to list it on Auto Tempest. And if you haven't already learned that Auto Tempest is an awesome website that allows you to search all of the major listing sites nationally with one search. They allow you to search Cars.com and Car Gurus and eBay and all of them by just entering the criteria once. They save you a lot of time, and it is honestly the smart way to search for a car. When I go out looking for something new, it is the first place that I stop. And so not only do we love them for supporting this crazy idea, but we love it because it is a very, very powerful tool. So be sure to check it out in the link in the description. But after we were done, immediately we started thinking about, can we do this again? And so I made the call to Auto Tempest. I said, hey, I hope you saw a good return and a lot of good traffic from the 14 million views that the first series of Car Trek has already gotten, and we'd love to do it again. And they said yes. And of course, we wanted to do a different premise of some other car buying challenge. And so we were looking around at different ideas, and We love depreciated supercars. Honestly, it's what fills up all of our garages. And so we said, all right, we looked at the best, 60-ish $1,000 car, but we should look at something cheaper. What is the most depreciated supercar you could buy? Now, there's some obvious culprits of normal supercar depreciation, like Bentley and Maserati and Aston Martin. And having worked at Aston Martin Atlanta, we had multiple franchises along with Lamborghini and McLaren. I do love the brand. The cars are really cool. The craftsmanship is great. The history of the brand is great. And quite honestly, the customers are very diverse and interesting. You would assume they're all James Bond wannabes, and they all come to you with these international man of mystery business cards, which is a cryptic name and phone number. And certainly that does happen. I've had people show up and be impressed to show me how much cash you actually can fit in a Zero Halliburton briefcase. And I'm sure they all have their Walter PPKs and all the things that a James Bond aficionado would have, their Omega watches and probably Bond girls at home. But it's not all like that. In fact, the Rapide is the only sports car that you can comfortably put a 7-foot-tall athlete in. So we've had a lot of NBA players come and buy those. I sold one to Jarrett Jack, who I went to Georgia Tech with and stayed in touch with. I sold one to Zach Randolph. And a lot of these guys that I knew from playing AAU basketball 15, 20 years ago, they have come in and bought them, and that's what they drive because you can put the seat so far back, and it's a great car, very comfortable to use. And in fact, that's what Hoovie ended up replacing his 360 Spider with at the end of Car Trek 1. Also, we've had the NBA player that I talked about that stole our DBS, and I had to chase that down. So you have a lot of really high-profile people that love them. I also sold one to the guy that probably killed JonBenet Ramsey. And, I sold him two. I sold him a Rapide and a DB9 Volante. I had the guy that had the most negative equity as a percentage ever that I saw. He had a DB9 that he had bought right before the economic decline of 2008 and 9, and he owed 150 grand on a car that was worth 40. It's almost unbelievable that it was possible, but depreciation happens. And so as I was out looking and remembering all the crazy stories that I had of buying and selling Astons, I sold one to a guy that turned out to be a pedophile, and we had to kick him out of the dealership after he was propositioning one of the Instagram photographers that was wandering around the showroom. I sold some to some local televangelist. I sold the Vanquish that ended up becoming stick converted, and then it burnt the guy's house down. He came and told that story here on the channel. So I love the brand. I love all the stories that surround Aston Martin ownership, Aston Martin driving, and it was one of my bucket list cars that quite honestly, I'd never kind of had the occasion to buy. So as we start looking for the most appreciated supercars, I'm out here looking at old DB7s, early DB9s, and Vanquishes. I really, really, really wanted to get a Vanquish. I think it's one of the most impressive looking cars that Aston ever did. And when you look at where Aston was at the time the car was new relative to the rest of the interesting cars that you could buy, it was really, really hard to find anything cooler than a Vanquish. Certainly people bought 575s and 911s and things like that. But back before 2003 and 4, when the real explosion of exotic car production happened, this was about as cool as something got. And I remember seeing my first one and just thinking, goodness gracious, I don't know that a car could be any prettier than that. Now, of course, today we see these cars as heavy with bad transmissions that are wildly unreliable, and most of those reasons are why the cars depreciated so severely, and that's why they're worth searching for in this type of context. But the question of this series of Car Trek was really going to be that if you buy one of these cars that is so depreciated and has lost so much value because of these reasons that we all know about, do they detract enough from the ownership experience that it's not worth it? No, they're absolutely worth owning, and it's a great deal to buy these cars relative to the cars that are 3 or 4 times the money for just being a little bit better. So in browsing Auto Tempest, I found a 2003 Aston Martin Vanquish with about 26,000 miles, and it was listed at a dealership, but that dealership also had it coming up for sale at a Mannheim auction. And so I got Doug Tabbitt to watch the auction for me, and I said, hey, let's see what we can buy this car for. And it turned out that not that many people were bidding on it that day in Mannheim, Los Angeles. And so I think we won it in the low 20s, but it was on an if, meaning they didn't have to take that number. And so we started this back and forth negotiation. And I think they wanted 50 grand. And honestly, that's a pretty fair price for a bottom feeder Vanquish. That's about what they tend to bring. but I couldn't pay that because I would certainly need to be closer to 90% off of the original MSRP of this car, which would have been about $245,000. Now, the interesting thing is that it was owned by a dealer, but being represented by a small independent California auction at Mannheim, Los Angeles. And so as we're talking to all these people, nobody really knows much about the history of this car. There's no service records, there's no disclosure. Obviously the car is being sold as is, so I don't really know what I'm getting into. But as Doug and I are researching this car, he says, wow, it looks like it was owned by a drug lord. I said, what do you mean? And he sent me the Carfax, and I said, oh man, I hadn't even thought to pull it. Yes, the car just returned to America from Colombia. And not the district, not South Carolina. And it was actually from Cartagena is where it appears to have been imported and exported. I don't know what city it spent time in because Carfax and VINwiki, unfortunately, don't have records from Colombia at this time. And so inevitably it would have lived a hard life. But after some back and forth, I told him what I needed to pay. It needed to be in the 20s, so I paid $29,000 for this car. Certainly the cheapest Vanquish that I have ever seen sell. The cheapest one I remember at the dealership was $55,000. That's been a little while. I know there's more. I saw one advertised in the 40s, but $29,000 was a steal, regardless of what I was getting. Now, of course, a few days later, it shows up on a truck, and I learned that I was not getting nearly as much Vanquish as I thought. It comes off, the car's already in limp mode, it's got a gearbox fault, it's just very, very unwell. It's also out of gas, and so the next day, I get somebody to follow me because I'm not even sure it's going to make it the 1.5 miles from my house to a gas station. We get it filled up, and that helps a little bit, but still, it's very quick to shut down half the motor. They're notorious for fouling fuel pumps. The clutch was not engaging the way that you'd want it to. It was leaking a little bit of fluid here and there, so I said, all right, it's going to be time to get this to the mechanic. And when I did so, I actually took it to the guy who was the master tech at Aston Martin Atlanta while I was there. Now he works out of an independent shop. And he sent me a text message and he said, Ed, I don't think whoever worked on this car recently had any tools. And if you ask me, I would have accused the car of never having been driven on a road. Now, of course, I don't want to disparage the developing world to say that the only way a Colombian could be able to afford an Aston Martin is to be a drug lord, or that there's no developed roads and good places to drive it. But this car would certainly indicate that there wasn't. And so I was a little bit concerned that, driving this car around on all these challenges, what could still be in the door panels or in parts of the car that I can't easily access. So fortunately, I have a friend from church that has a drug dog. So I went over to his house and had his drug dog, Mattis, who was actually on like America's Top Dog, some like American Ninja Warrior thing. It has a ton of followers on TikTok, this dog. But I had him sniff around on it, and fortunately, he said the coast was clear. So great dog, great owner, and I certainly appreciate them. But the car was good. I ended up, honestly, and it was strange because the car needed everything that the Flood Gallardo needed before I did Car Trek 1. And obviously, we get these cars, and it's not exactly like it just shows up sight unseen and we just start doing the challenge. There is some prep work required to be able to make these cars make the trip. But I needed both fuel pumps, just like the Gallardo. I needed a throwout bearing because it was leaking, and therefore I needed a clutch. And so I did all three things to the Vanquish right before going, and I learned that the Vanquish clutch is twice as much as the clutch parts for an LP640. It's the most expensive clutch, barring a double clutch car, that I've ever seen. And when we got it, I looked for every cross-reference, every Jaguar Ford thing with it. Inevitably, it was a parts bin thing from somewhere, but I could not find it. But I also learned that the Magneti Marelli shift actuator and pump and system that they use for the sequential manual transmission on a Vanquish is effectively the same thing that's in any single clutch sequential Italian car from Ferrari or Lamborghini. But they bought the base, cheapest, minimalist package, and so they don't learn the clutch thickness as well, they don't behave as well, and it is quite honestly the worst single clutch sequential paddle shift transmission that I think was ever put into a car. But that terrible transmission is the reason this car is so cheap. Sometimes when cars are really expensive to maintain, like a Veyron, it just means that nobody goes in trying to buy them for $500 or $600 except me, because they know that they can't afford to keep the car going. The alternative is something like an Aston or a Maserati, where nobody wants to take the risks of all the terrible maintenance costs, and so they just don't buy them, and that causes the massive depreciation. But again, we wanted to see if that made them the best supercar value out there. And so, honestly, we had a great time. The series went well. I think you're going to love it. You can check it out on Freddie's channel, the Tavares channel, and we'll have some more content here and on Hoovie's channel as well. But regardless, Car Trek 2 was an absolute blast. Honestly, it was probably even more fun than Car Trek 1, and I am pleased to say that Car Trek 3 is happening for a Christmas special. So thank you guys so much for watching Car Trek 1. Please check out Car Trek 2. Let us know what you thought of both of them here in the comments, and please subscribe to all 3 channels for more Car Trek content.
You couldn't have a better way to burn a house down than with a Aston Martin Vanquish manual. I'm playing hockey, ice hockey, and my goalie, he's got this Lotus Elise. I love fast four-bangers, making a lot out of little. So I grabbed that Elise from him. My wife, she gave me a lot of hard time. It's loud. When it rained, it leaked. It always leaked. You know, it leaks on you. It leaks all the time, you know. There's always wind. It smells like epoxy. All those great things of a Lotus, but, you know, you can just drive that thing safely at whatever speed you want. Love that car. And then as she was kind of like, I need a nicer car, like going out to dinner and this isn't working for me, I start looking. At this time, I was looking at a Vanquish. I love those early Vanquishes, just stunning. But the transmission and all that kind of stuff, you know, it was fine. But I'm a manual guy. Yeah, I knew that a manual conversion was an option and got to that pretty quickly. So getting in touch with Aston Martin Works over there, I mean, those guys are just amazing. It took forever to ship it over. I mean, this thing got shipped out of here, went to Jersey, sat in a warehouse. I wondered how many people have been their hands through this thing. And it finally made its way, and they gave me the digital compass of the boat. You know, I could watch this thing floating through all these islands, and it finally gets there. And they go through this car, and, you know, they kind of pick through it and find everything they want to replace. And these are the guys who built that car, so the energy behind it was great. You know, they just like, they love it. She's home. So getting that conversion was fantastic. I mean, they spent so much time sending me pictures each week. This is where we are. So it's sitting over there. It takes forever and ever. And now it's kind of ready. They're shipping it back. It took forever to get it there. It took forever and ever and ever to get it back. The US sucks. It's just like they give all these different fees and causes to stop. They thought there was drugs in it or something, so they stopped it at the port, wanted to go through it extra. So finally it's on its way, and it's 2 a.m. in the morning. Tow truck guy who comes back's on a flatbed, and he comes pulling in. They loaded it on a flat ramp, a flat dock off the ship, which is great. But now you can't get it off. So here it's 2 a.m. in the morning here in Alpharetta, you know, coming, and we're trying to get it off the back. You can't. So I'm going to each neighbor, try to get their driveway, the right load to get that car off without killing it. And that car is loud, and trying to start that thing, turn it off, start the thing at 2 in the morning. Oh my gosh, so we finally get it. We finally get it off. We get it in the driveway. We're really kind of happy, and this thing drives fantastic. I mean, that is a big car. It's a heavy car. Driving it, you kind of got to be a man with the clutch and everything else. It takes a challenge, which makes it even more fun. The next car I bought was a Vantage, a little V12 Vantage, good track car. I had the Vanquish for love, had the Vantage for screaming. When you got in that Vanquish, you knew, you know, this thing was built with care and thoughts and depth, and let's stay alive and let's give people something they've never sat in before. So lived and loved that car, and even took it to some track days, and it handled really well. You know, compared to the Lotus, I was expecting a lot of weight and a lot of push, and it was there, but it still handled really well. And I'm like, from what I read and what I heard, I go, I don't know where this big lunking curvy car is. This thing handles fantastic. It's got giddy up. So I just kind of took that with me. Left the track and moved on. Later on, I have it looked at with Jason at Pinnell Motorsports, and he goes, Mike, you got 9 spokes on this car. I'm like, what is 9 spokes? He goes, these wheels are not normal for a Vanquish. I go, he goes, well, I'm trying to order in the parts for the wishbone, and some of the bushings were worn. And that's where he noticed, when he got parts in from Aston Martin, that they were just different. And he goes, this doesn't fit your car. And he calls Aston Martin, and they go, well, and he finally give him the VIN number. He goes, that's not a regular Vanquish. You've got an SPD. And he goes, what's an SPD? And And that was where we knew this thing had, that's why it worked so well on the track, and it had the S suspension and all other changes, which is really kind of cool. So it really wasn't an S, but it really was underneath. It was a fantastic car. Once you hit 130, it just screamed after that. It just flat, comfortable, pinky on the steering wheel to a $190. It's just crazy. And then comes New Year's Eve, one of the most exciting days of my life. And I took that car out. All these new Astons come out are gorgeous, but she just hung right in there and is absolutely stunning. Took her home that evening and had a big party at my house. My daughters have 100 friends over. I've got buddies over I play hockey with and race with, all this kind of good stuff. And at the same night, so I race Lemons cars. I've got this Lemons BMW, which is it's a lot of fun. All right, that night I decided to put in a keg system, of course, to drink out of. And so we're drilling in the garage, and we've got the Vanquish, we've got the wife's car. Thank goodness my other Vantage is out. So once we got the keg system working in a Lemons car, I was driving around in the neighborhood just visiting parties, and everybody's drinking out of the back of the Lemons car. And I look back in the house, and I see smoke. Hey, what's all that smoke? Who's having fireworks? And as we look back, I'm like, that's really close to my place. And I'm sitting there at the back of the little BMW Lemons race car. I'm like, man, that is way. So I put my Via down and do a little trot up, and I see us coming out of my place. So I go boiling up there, and lo and behold, my house is just burning, and the fire is in the garage. And then I see the tail of the Vanquish, and it's just way royal. It's just so boiling so much, and the fire department won't run into the house. There's kids in there. So I go in the back door, and I'm like, come on, let's go. And they wouldn't even go. So I shoot in the back door. I'm scouring the house, flames and fire, looking for a kid scared, hid behind a couch, hid in the bathroom, and they still won't come in. So I'm running through this stuff, and upstairs, downstairs, I go running out of the house. Now I'm looking for my one girl who's, no one knows where she is. So I'm in the front street. Where's my daughter Lexi? Everyone doesn't know. So I turn around, creeping through the house, running through fire, and they finally scream, she's out here now. And that's all settled. So I come boiling on out, smoky and fiery. Everything, it just boils. And the fire department can't find water. They find water and the fire hydrant then fails. They're trying to find another hydrant, and that 20 minutes that passed, this little mansion kind of burned down, and the Vanquish is in it. The next day I get going, and I've got to go find out where my baby, you know. So I get back in, and everything just kind of going through all the burn stuff. I got to find what's left, what's up for the family, what's up for that. All the insurance companies wouldn't come close because they said the house is going to fall down. So my buddy shows up with a Rolls Royce, and we end up dragging all these cars out with a suicide door Rolls Royce. We're not quite sure whether it was fireworks, because we were shooting fireworks ourselves. There were neighbors shooting fireworks. The garage was a little open. The Vanquish and the car cover sitting on the ground. We drove the Lemons car out, and we're driving around the hood, but we really don't know. It's hard to blame the Vanquish. The insurance company wanted to know everything about the Vanquish and blame the Vanquish because they're all looking to put it on somebody else. So the car came in hot. I came in about dinner time on New Year's Eve. I was at the office giving the car some love. I always run it up and down the highway, give it, you know, open, get out the spider webs, as they say. And then we're drilling in the Lemons car, making beer and keg enhancements, which is not what normally people do in their garage on New Year's Eve. And then going through the insurance, yeah, so those folks were looking at a standard Vanquish with, I think it was 15,000 miles on it. And unfortunately for those cars, they just don't get a lot of love. It's a loss because they're beautifully built. And when you sit in an original Vanquish, and I've sit in new Vanquishes, and they're gorgeous cars all day long. There's nothing like a first round Vanquish. You're immersed in this British love, and those folks spent so much effort on those cars, and you could see it. You could just see all the tufting and just everything that they've loved about that car to keep Aston Martin alive was in that. That energy was so much in that car. And for folks who have an original Vanquish, who are looking at putting those to a manual conversion, they should. I mean, that's what that car should have been built with, and that's what you should do with it. If you own that, you should do it, because that's the right thing to do. You could fly those guys over and they will try to do it, but they don't have their tools, they don't have their dies, they don't have the leather guy from Aston Martin Works ready to do everything. So they'll make it happen, but you can send it back in, and I was maybe the same amount. It may have been $1,000 more to have the guys from Aston Martin Works do it, and the leather guy, and everyone who just does that for a living to kind of put it together. So send it over, and you'd be so happy. And it's absolutely, the care is crazy. I want to find a true Vanquish S, black, 2.0, no back seats, and make it a manual. That's, in my opinion, the ultimate Vanquish. Love the new ones, but that original Vanquish, just once you get in that thing, it's just, you absolutely know you car that was built with love. And the goal is to really take that engine out of there, and we're gonna make the most badass coffee table. And I've also got the steering wheel, which had no idea that's what the steering wheel looked like once it had been smelted. But man, that is something I'll have forever. And then fighting through the house to get my key, you know, I got that. As melted as that is, I've got the Vanquish key.
I take all sorts of forms of payment, not including Bitcoin or private tutoring. So every car guy has an irrational penchant for a certain car that maybe nobody else loves, and maybe a few other weird people do. One of mine is the Aston Martin DB7 GT. Now, I love the standard DB7 just for the styling. I think that era Aston Martin is unquestionably beautiful, and certainly much more beautiful than the pigs coming out of the 80s from the same company, and well, pretty much from every automotive company at that time period. In particular, the Vantage, because of the V12 engine and the vastly improved suspension over the regular DB7. But then the GT is the pinnacle of the DB7 design. They actually took a grand touring car and made it as close to a real sports car as you could. Bigger Brembo brakes in front. I think they were 14-inch rotors. And again, more finely tuned suspension over the regular Vantage. A little bit of extra horsepower, not much, but enough. And some other cosmetic touches as well, including an integrated fiberglass rear spoiler into the rear deck lid and a different hood, which is now about $7,000 to get if you wanted to, you know, make your regular Vantage look like a GT. True to Aston Martin form, making parts unobtainium by their prices. So, and of course in 03, that was the tail end of the DB7 production, and it was right at the beginning of the Vanquish production, which was Aston Martin's flagship car. That was the car that got all the attention that everybody loved at the time. As with good authors and artists, they're never appreciated in their time. And I think that'll be true of the DB7 GT as well, because the Vanquishes are starting to become very unloved because of their horrendously unreliable and expensive transmissions, except for the few that have been converted by Aston Martin Works to a manual. And the DB7 GT is actually reasonably reliable for a British car, and it's a manual, and I think it is a true driver's car. It's beautiful, it sounds good, and it is absolutely a thrill to drive. You know, some drawbacks certainly. The dashes like to shrink, as pretty much any British or Italian car does, and there's no vertical height adjustment in the driver's seat, so if you are taller than extra medium, you're probably going to hit your head on the roof. True car guys find their way around those types of obstacles for a car they love. The DB7 GT, they actually made more manuals than automatics. I would have to check VINwiki on this, but according to the Nuts for Sticks database anyway, there's 64 manuals and there's 17 automatics made for the US. And the automatics were called the GTA. Now it's rare, I think, for a collectible car to have fewer automatics, but in this case, rarity does not equal desirability, as the automatics tend to trade for 35 to 45 grand and the manuals trade in the $50,000 to $80,000 range, depending on color and mileage and condition. Now, I've been tracking the GT manuals for quite a while. I've transacted probably about 50% of the ones that have sold in the last 5 years, which is about 6. Most of them are still with their original owners, and they don't come up for sale very often. But I had a unique opportunity to sell a DB7 GTA. And it was actually about a 2-year process that started with a friend of mine emailing me one of his friends' listings for sale. And it was this DB7 GTA. And he was asking about $65,000. I said, well, thank you for the lead, but the guy's out of his mind. We communicated briefly, and I thought it was worth maybe $40,000. And he, of course, thought I was equally as insane. And I think like 2 years later, he circled back because he'd been trying to sell the car the whole time. And he finally was just like, I want to wash my hands of it, please buy it. And I bought it for maybe 35 grand, something like that, and immediately sold it to one of my clients who wanted to try an Aston Martin and didn't have the same need for a third pedal that I did. So he thought it was a great deal. So he loved it for a little bit and then traded it back in as his pattern. About every 3 to 4 months, he wants to try something else. So I put it up for sale again. Now, before putting it up for sale, we sent it to one of our local shops to have serviced. And it was there a little bit longer than normal because we were trying to figure out some evaporative system issues. Because when you tried to put the fuel in, it would keep backing up. And there was some issues somewhere within the evaporative system that was, again, true to British car form, very difficult to chase down. So while it was there, it did sit outside, which is not uncommon for a lot of shops. That little detail of it sitting outside became a pretty big deal. Frank up at the shop called me one day and he goes, I think you need to come in. That's never a good phone call. It's never a phrase you want to hear because it either means, hey, you need to look at what I'm about to fix that's going to cost you thousands of dollars, or you need to come see in person why I backed into your car or something like that. We've all heard the horror stories, and some people have experienced the horror stories of techs wrecking their cars, and nobody ever wants to get that phone call. But this one was a little bit different. So I show up to the shop and proceed to find black marks, like tar, all over one side of the car. I'm like, what in the heck is that? And he goes, well, the neighbor's parking lot was seal coated over the weekend, and it looks like they got some overspray on the car. I was like, wow, that's unfortunate. So we go next door to kind of check it out from the other side of the chain link fence, and it quickly becomes apparent that this probably wasn't a case of the guy, losing control of his seal coating wand. It looked pretty deliberate because, these guys know what they're doing. You could see where they had painted just perfectly along the curb. And then all of a sudden, there was just a line on the fence on the other side of which was the Aston Martin where they somehow missed the ground and went 8 feet in the air and got the entire fence. The Aston was parked in a corner next to the fence, so it continued around here and stopped again at the edge of the Aston Martin. So I'm like, wow, somebody didn't like David Brown or I don't know what, but apparently somebody was having a bad day. So we filed a police report because we had to get it on record in case it was indeed malicious. And we determined the name of the seal coating company from the neighbor so that we could call them and inform them that they needed to pay for their misdeeds. Now, while doing that, of course, I had it sent to a detail shop so we could determine what the extent of the damage was. Here I am thinking, essentially, this car is going to need a full repaint plus diminished value. This could be tens of thousands of dollars, and that's going to be a big fight because I don't think anybody wants to shell out that kind of money for a stupid little vandalism. So while I'm determining what the extent of the damage is, we're trying to talk to this company to get them to agree that this was a bad thing that they did and they should pay us for it. And it turns out that the name of the company, I won't give it away, but it implied that it was people that teach that also seal coat. So I guess they do it in the summer during their summer break. But Frank brought up an interesting point. He said, well, if this is vandalism, that can be a felony. If that gets on their record, they'll lose their teaching license and they will no longer be people that educate and seal coat. They will be people that only seal coat. So we had a little bit of leverage there. Initially, he seemed very amicable to paying for the damage and said, I'll file an insurance claim, not a problem. But he certainly wouldn't admit any guilt that, it was something he did intentionally. But as time went on, I started getting somewhat cryptic and dodgy texts from him as to why he couldn't file an insurance claim or hadn't filed one yet. He didn't want that on his insurance record, didn't want to pay the deductible, all sorts of things like that are making me think, man, this guy is a real deadbeat, and I'm going to probably end up in court over this. Thankfully, during that time, I got the report back from the detailing shop, and they said, yes, indeed, this will buff out. So I had them just complete the work because I wasn't going to let that sit on the car forever because that could cause worse problems. So I said, let's just fix it. I'll pay the $1,500, get the car back ready for sale, and then deal with this teacher on the side. We got it all fixed up, got it back into my inventory, and continued to pursue this guy for the measly $1,500 that he now owed. And we had given him quite a scare because initially I said, hey, this car may need to be repainted, and you're on the hook for all of this. So I thought that when I said, hey, look, you only owe me $1,500, he would be elated and just run to drop the cash off to me. And as is the case with most deadbeats and automotive brokers, he stalled and made up excuses and continued to make up excuses, all the while promising, oh, yeah, no, we'll make this right. And I'm like, okay, well, it's very easy to make it right. It's called $1,500. I take all sorts of forms of payment, not including Bitcoin or private tutoring. He kept dragging this out so long that the police officer who was handling this was fantastic. And he stopped by Frank's shop to just kind of check in and say, hey, how's things going with this? Because he had some interest in seeing it resolved as well. He was pretty perturbed about it and, just wanted to see justice done. So while he was at Frank's shop, Frank told him the story and said how this guy was delaying, and that really chapped the cops, I think. And so he got on the phone and called him old school cop style and just said, hey, listen, I'm going to come pay you a visit because this is a vandalism charge if you don't get this resolved. And if you don't get it resolved today, you're going to be arrested for vandalism and you're probably going to lose your teacher's license. And I don't know what else he said. I'm summarizing because I wasn't there. But whatever he said was effective because about 5 minutes later, Mr. Teacher called me with a credit card number to pay for the $1,500 in damage. And at that point, I wasn't going to squawk about the 3% that it cost me to run his credit card. I was just thankful that the cop did his job, that he was willing to put some good old school pressure on the guy to pay his bill such that we didn't have to go through a massive legal battle. As much as I can be vindictive sometimes in my heart, I never want to see somebody truly lose their ability to do their profession. And I'm sure he was probably a better teacher than he was seal coater. The DB7 itself is in wonderful condition. There was no lasting damage and it polished out beautifully and got a full paint correction and polish in the meantime. So it actually looked better. And the new owner loved it for a few years and just recently sold it through RM at Monterey. So it's now with another new owner who will, I'm sure, love it and beat the tar out of it. I would like to think, I don't know if this actually happened, but I would like to think that in the conversation with the cop and the teacher slash seal coater, that the cop said something to the effect of, if you don't pay this and you get a felony on your record, it'll be your own ass fault.
I guess that was the first urine bandit to hit motor cars of Georgia. So I can't say that my first day selling cars was quite as successful as Rabbit's, but I did sell a car on my first day. It wasn't anything terribly exotic. It was a BMW 650 convertible. It took a few more days for me to sell my first Lamborghini, and even though that was a stick mercy, it wasn't exactly the kind of car that you were super proud to be representing. It had giant Ford Giotto wheels and this huge aftermarket wing and a bunch of other stuff on it. Just not the nicest example and not what you're just super proud to sell. But a few days after that, I sold kind of our first, core product. It was a 2009 Gallardo LP560, a matte white car, one of two that they brought into the US that year. Bianco Canopus, Lamborghini called it. A big sticker car, super awesome. And I actually sold it to an NBA veteran. He'd played over 10 years in the league and wasn't really like a household name, but sort of a player to be named later in a whole bunch of trades, played for a bunch of different teams and made the league minimum for a lot of years, millions of dollars playing basketball. Super cool. So it was an awesome deal. I was really happy to sell him that car. He came in and loved it and, drove it away that day. And that night, my wife and I went out to celebrate, and he actually drove right past us on our way to dinner. And I flagged him down and said, "Hey man, awesome. I'm glad you're enjoying the car." And he was over the moon, just absolutely loving it. And the next day was my day off. And I was kind of early enough in my car sales career that I thought you actually took your days off. I mean, generally you work 1 or 2 days on the weekend. So one of the weekdays you'll have is your day off, but generally you don't take it. And the reason for that is what happened the day I went back to work. I walk into the showroom and the car's right there. And so I'm like, "Guys, what happened?" He said, "Well, he came back yesterday and fell out of love with the color and wanted this Grigio Telesto brand new car that we had. And so we sold it to him and took this back in on trade." And obviously I got no credit for the deal, didn't make anything on it. It's just a miserable dog eat dog world that you got to learn some ways. And so I was a little bit upset about that, but I maintained the relationship with the client. And actually a couple of months later, I sold him another car. I sold him a BMW M6. He traded in his daily driver CL63 at the time. And it took a long time to do the deal, and actually he brought in this English Bulldog puppy that he said he'd bought the day before and flown in from Germany. It was like $5,000 dog, and the dog was obviously not housebroken. It was peeing all over the showroom, and he didn't really seem bothered by this, so I had a porter that had to follow the dog around cleaning up after it while we negotiated this car deal. And I guess that was the first urine bandit to hit Motor Cars of Georgia. So he ends up buying this car, and it just takes forever, probably an hour, 2 hours after we should have closed. We finally get everything worked out, and he and the dog in the car leave. And he had said at the time that he wasn't just loving the Lamborghini, he kind of wanted something a little bit more comfortable, and we had just gotten the Aston Martin franchise. And as a dealership, when you get a new franchise, the manufacturer just floods you with inventory. So we probably had 25 new but aging Aston Martins that were strange color combinations or, bad options or high stickers and really hard to sell. And we were trying to sell through them, and the manufacturer was just leaning on us to hit numbers each quarter. And so around the end of June in 2010, we had this DBS Volante, and it was a quantum silver over Tuscan tan car. And Tuscan tan is kind of Aston Martin speak for Grey Poupon mustard yellow. It's kind of a strange color, but quantum silver is gorgeous. Obviously, it's a color from Quantum of Solace, the Bond movie. Even though Casino Royale and Quantum of Solace are scripted to be moment-to-moment sequential, the color of the car actually changes between the films. And so Quantum's a great color, and he had seen that car a couple of times, and I called him and I said, "Hey, why don't you bring the guy up? Let's see if we can work out some sort of a trade deal." And so he does, and we go back and forth for a long time. He just loved to drag negotiations out and seem really hard and like he was trying to make us work harder, but eventually we'd get him to wherever we needed to be. Sometimes it just took a really long time. And so, as usual, this was a Friday. It just drug on and on. After we should have closed at 7, we probably finished at about 8:30. And of course, he didn't bring the title to the Lamborghini, and he can't go authorize a wire transfer or get a certified check. So he says, "Ed, will y'all take a personal check for this thing?" And I'm like, "Well, it's not my call, but I'll certainly go ask." So I go ask my general manager. I said, "Hey, obviously, he didn't bring the title, but he wants the car. Do you want to take a personal check for the difference?" And he said, "Sure. I mean, this guy's an NBA player, made a lot of money. He's bought a bunch of cars. I mean, I can't imagine anything will go wrong." So, back then we wrote temp tags and on these iridescent strips, handwritten on these paper tags. So I put one on the car, and about 8:30, he leaves on Friday night. So the next day, Saturday morning, I get in the office and I shoot him a text. I know he doesn't wake up until 12 or 1, and I say, "Hey, let me know if you want me to send somebody down to grab that title, or if you're you're going to bring it in, you know, how we can help. And I hope you're loving the DBS. And we get carried away with selling cars that day, and I don't hear anything back. And so as we leave, my boss is like, all right, just make sure you get it on Monday. We'll get it all sorted out. So Monday I get in, I call him, and I don't get an answer. And we deposit the check and, you know, just assume that at some point he's going to bring this title. But nothing to get too freaked out about at that point. But later that day, he calls me back and he says, hey, Ed, I'm sorry. I had to run out of town for a few days. I'll be back like Wednesday, Thursday, and I'll bring you that title. I said, well, that's not what you said. He said, yeah, I'm sorry. I had to go. Sorry about that. And so I tell my boss, I'm like, I don't know what we can do. I mean, I don't know how else we're going to get the title. He said, all right, well, we'll just see when he gets back. So a few days later, we get a call from our bank, and they say that the check had bounced. Insufficient funds. And I'm still trying to get in touch with him. He hadn't brought the title. And at this point, he's, you know, not answering. And while he says he's out of town, we keep seeing the car pop up on a website called Chasing Exotics. And Chasing Exotics was a website that Doug DeMuro started and used to run before he became an automotive journalist. And it was an exotic car spotting website, mostly in Atlanta and Hong Kong, of all places, but a pretty interesting thing. And so we saw the car showing up around Atlanta, so we knew he was in town and driving it. And so I keep trying to call him, ask him what's going on, and we get nothing back. And so finally I get in touch with him. He's like, oh man, I'm sorry. I deposited some money. I thought it would hit. I'm sorry that didn't clear. I'll send a wire or, you know, bring you a check tomorrow. Tomorrow comes and he doesn't show up, doesn't answer. And so after a few days, my boss steps in and calls him and goes from zero to high order insanity immediately. And it's like, you stole this car. I'm going to send the police after you. I've got repo men looking for it. You're going to jail, all this craziness. And obviously the guy just shuts down, stops answering the phone, and won't talk to my GM anymore. I'm like, oh goodness, what are we going to do here? And so I kind of try to play the good guy. You know, obviously Aston Martin hostage negotiation is not something you sign up for, but in these situations where there's nothing really I can do to make it any worse, but there is a chance that I could help lead to a better outcome, it's the perfect opportunity to kind of show that you're a team player and that you can do things beyond the normal skill set that would be expected of somebody in your position. And so I keep talking to him and trying to offer different options, like, do you want to find a cheaper Aston or finance the difference? I mean, what can we do to help? Because I mean, obviously I knew he had the title to the Lambo somewhere, but he just was clearly not ready to proceed with the deal. And it just drags on, and we're not getting much help from the cops, and the repo men can't really get into the community because it's gated, and we're not exactly sure where he's at. And so we're just kind of at a stalemate for days, turning into weeks and going over a month. And so after about 35, 40 days, his temp tag's expired. He can't drive the car anymore. He's not responding to my GM, but occasionally I'll get something back from him. And finally I get him to say, hey, you can come meet me for dinner and we'll talk about this. So I asked my general manager, I'm like, what do you want me to do? I mean, I don't know what to negotiate with this guy on. He said, well, we're not having any luck with the cops or anything else. And this was a lot like some of the stolen rental car situations where it's really more of a civil matter and you know who has it. So it's not like a all points bulletin, be on the lookout sort of thing. So there's not much help they offer with multiple jurisdictions being involved. And he's like, all right, well, just go to dinner, see what you can figure out. So I show up and it's this guy and his entourage, and he's like, man, I don't know. I thought I had this money coming in. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do now. I drove the car a little bit. I think I just want you to give me the money that you were going to give me on trade for the Gallardo, and then I'll just give you the Aston Martin back. I'm like, well, problem with that is an over allowance. And sometimes when somebody won't take what their trade's really worth, you pretend to give them more and you just don't discount the other side as much as you really are. And so where the car might have been worth 150, 160 grand, we probably showed him 180 or 90. And so he thought his car was worth a lot more. And I had to tell him, well, if we take the profit of this car out of the deal, we have to give you what your car is really worth. And I don't know if they still want your car, but I'll try. He's like, all right, well, if you can get them to write me a check for that, I understand what it's really worth, then I'll give you the Aston Martin back and give you the title. So the next morning I go back into the office and I'm like, all right, this is what he agreed to. And they're like, no, I'm not buying that car. I don't want to see it anymore. I'm not doing anything else with this guy. I'm like, well, that's fine. I don't know what else to offer. I just believe he will perform to this agreement because he said it and it's right now for us to go and do. And finally, like, all right, just whatever. It's the only hope we have to get this car back amicably or reasonably amicably. Go get it. I went down with a porter. He drove me down so I could drive the DBS back. I got the title of the Lamborghini. He signed it. I got the DBS. Fortunately, it was no real worse for wear. I think he'd driven it 350, 400 miles. Nothing too terrible. I think he curbed a wheel or two, but again, nothing that can't be easily fixed. So fortunately, it's kind of resolved. I take the car back, we re-PDI it and get it listed for sale again. And we never heard from this customer anymore, unfortunately, but we sold his Gallardo to a really good customer up in Tennessee, and he owned a bunch of interesting cars and loved it. It was a really good deal on a barely used Gallardo LP 560. And we kept the DBS, and we got more incentives back from Aston, but it wasn't really eligible for those because we'd had to punch it when we thought we had it sold, because they were leaning on us to sell more units that quarter, and we thought it was sold, and it took several days for the check to bounce, and so we weren't eligible for the greater rebates and incentives that came down the road. It sat around for another 7 months, and actually the same guy that bought the Gallardo ended up buying the DBS for his wife. And they'd had other DBSs in every awesome car, and he loved it. Drove it for a little while, and actually found out that in 2016, the car got exported to the Netherlands. That's one of the things we love about VINwiki, is the chance to kind of see what happens to cars kind of after they fall out of touch, or you don't know where they've ended up. And sometimes those days where you learn the most about the car business are not the best financially. The little commission they'd paid me on the not terribly profitable deal where we'd sold this DBS in the first place got charged back, and I never got any thank you or anything for having recovered it. But on those days where you don't get the recognition or the praise that you think you might deserve, at least you end up with a really good story to show for it. And honestly, what more could you ask for?